Zaid is a strategist. He's a writer and he's a facilitator. He's also the co-founder of Rios Partners. Rios Partners, c'est un cabinet de consultants en innovation sociale qui s'attaque aux problèmes complexes, des problèmes à l'échelle mondiale. Ils aident les équipes d'intervenants ensemble à relever des défis les plus redoutables. Zaid has over a decade of experience in developing strategic responses to complex social challenges, including community development, climate change, child malnutrition, energy, financial systems, global food systems, security issues. The list is pretty long. His clients have included organizations as diverse as the World Bank, the UN foundations, the various governments, as well as Oxfam, World Wildlife Foundation, and many others. And he has been a guest lecturer at Oxford, University of Bergen, Norway, and the New School in New York. He is currently a visiting professor at the California College of Arts. Zaid will speak to us, and then, if time allows it, he will take questions from the audience. Please join me in welcoming Zaid Hassan. Sorry.
Morning, everyone. I'm not going to speak from the podium. Just before we start, you've got a couple of bits of colored paper on your table. Has everyone got these? I'm just going to do a little technology test to see how these work for you. So can I ask you a question? The question is, how are you doing this morning? And so if you're really hungover, then you hold up a red card. If you're doing really well, you hold up a green one. If you're not quite sure, you hold up a yellow one. So go. And just look around the room. Okay, so we're doing pretty well. Good. So before I kind of get into the content, just a little bit about my background. So you heard the long list of things that I've been working on, which might suggest that I'm going to come here with lots of solutions and tell you how to solve all your problems. Well, that's not the case. When I first started doing this work, about 15 years ago, my assumption was that there are lots of people who've been doing this work for much longer than I have, get paid a lot more than I have, and I'm going to go and learn from those people. So I went to work for a small consultancy based in Boston, and I was the youngest person on the team, and there were authors and lecturers and speakers on the team, and people who are pretty well known for this work. And I thought I was just going to go and learn from them and do what they did, basically. And about a year later, and they had asked me to actually write down what they did. And they said, can you write down what we do? And we want to turn that into a book or a paper. And that was the beginnings of the book that some of you have seen. So anyway, so I took notes for a year. So I went to every meeting. I took my notebook to dinner, and I wrote everything down. And at the end of the year, they said, OK, so what have you got? And I said to them, you don't really want me to write this down. And I said, why? I said, because you don't really know what you're doing. And they said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, you kind of are doing something, but there's just big holes in your practice, and you don't really know what you're doing, and you don't want to tell people this. And they were a little bit upset, obviously, but that kind of drew me into the practice. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that no one is particularly good at doing this kind of stuff. So I have to remind myself that challenges are complex, and that's why they're hard, because they're complex. But I get asked a lot, how are we doing? So when I go to places, I was in New Zealand a couple of months ago, people say, well, how are we doing compared to everyone else? You go to all these different places. And I got asked that a couple of times here, which is, so, how do you think we're doing? And, where's New Brunswick with this? And, what do you think of our capacity to do this work? And, the good news is that no one knows how to do it. Right? So the playing field is quite level at this point when it comes to addressing complex challenges. So that's kind of a caveat. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to just share some of what I've learned over the last couple of years and my questions and some of what I'm seeing, and hopefully we can figure that out and take that forward together. Does that work for people? Yeah? Okay. So I'm gonna tell you three things. And the three things I'm gonna tell you are the news, which most of you have probably heard, and then there's the bad news, which some of you may have heard, and then there's the good news. So the three things that I'm going to talk about, the news is essentially that the world is getting more complex, right? We hear this word kind of used again and again and again to describe things. And it's becoming such a commonly used word that it's not necessarily clear what that means. So I want to try and give you a very specific way, if you like, of understanding what it means for challenges to be complex. So why are they complex? And there's a handout on your table if you just want to grab that. So on the first page of that, there are 3 graphs. Horror of horrors, graphs. So the graphs are basically, they demonstrate essentially increasing demand for resources, right? So increasing population typically means increasing demand for resources. As our population gets wealthier, we have more demand for natural resources. As our populations age, we have more demand for certain types of services, healthcare services, and so on. And so the challenge that I'm kind of seeing is that demand for these kind of things is going up generally. So the 3 graphs look at fresh water, so you're looking at water usage, and we're looking at agricultural productivity in Yemen, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, and we're looking at the number of hospital beds in the UK. Right? Now, demand for all of those things is going up, whereas supply is going down, as you can see from the graphs, right? Now, that presents a challenge, which is if these trends continue, then what happens? Yeah, so if these trends continue, where we continue to lose fresh water or run out of fresh water, or agricultural productivity declines to a point where we can't support the numbers of people we have, what happens? So the answer to that question is we don't really want to know. We don't want to get to a point where we discover what happens. And what I'm kind of finding in the work that I do is that these challenges exist at very localized levels and they exist at very global levels. So I've been working in Yemen over the last couple of years, and it's a case study in my book. And in Yemen, we have a population of about 23 million people. It's the fastest growing population in the Middle East. 50% of that population are under 15, so very young. And they're one of the first countries in the world that are going to run out of water. So Sana'a, Yemen's capital, is the first capital city in the world that's going to run out of water entirely. And they're also running out of oil. So around the same time they're going to run out of water, they're going to run out of oil. And they use oil revenues to buy 90% of their food. So basically, they're going to run out of water, oil, energy, and food all at the same time, while their population is going up quite dramatically. So that's an example, if you like, of 2 trends, if you like, that are going the wrong way. Demand and supply are going in opposite directions. And that's kind of the situation that we're facing everywhere. And obviously, it's not necessarily as dramatic as that. It's not as dramatic as we're going to run out of water and food and so on. But as demand goes up, people have responses to that if supply can't be met. And responses typically are to move. So what happens is, if you don't have jobs, you go somewhere you do have jobs. If you don't have natural resources, you typically go somewhere you do have natural resources, unless you have no choice. So mobility is the first strategy in response to these challenges at an individual level. People just move, basically. So in Yemen, anyone who can move has already moved. They've gone, right? So there's large diaspora Yemeni populations all around the world. So that's the news, which isn't very good. And I guess my question to all of you is, so I don't know what's happening here. I don't know what the situation in the province is, and I don't know how good or how bad things are, but I wanted to ask you that question. So the question I wanted to ask you was, just how hopeful are you about the future of New Brunswick, given what you know is currently going on in terms of the trends, and if you think about supply and demand, just what's kind of going on, and you think about mobility. So that's the question I want to ask you. So I want to use the colored cards, and basically, so if you're not very hopeful, then you hold up a red card. If you're unsure, so give it a minute, don't hold them up yet. I'm going to give you a minute to think about it. If you're not very sure, uncertain, don't know, then a yellow card, and if you're hopeful, hold up a green card. Yeah? So just take a minute to think about it. And also, if you don't have a card, grab a card. There's some on the neighboring tables. Just take a minute. Okay, can we vote? Hold them up so people can see them. And just look around the room. So just have a look around the room to see what you're seeing. So I see mostly yellow cards, some green, and a couple of red cards. Yeah, so uncertainty, I think, is the mood. Is that fair? Yeah? Okay. So here's the challenge, and here's the bad news, right? That was the news. That wasn't actually the bad news, believe it or not. So here's the bad news. The bad news is that obviously lots and lots of people are trying to respond to these challenges. It's not as if we're not doing anything about them. It's not as if we're kind of going, oh, I didn't know that. When did that happen? People are trying in lots of different ways to respond to these challenges. And they're trying all over the world, and they're trying here and everywhere else. And the bad news is that most of those efforts are not working. And the reason most of those efforts aren't working is because of the nature of the response. So the nature of the response to complex challenges is what I call business as usual. And another word for business as usual is strategic planning. Right? So what we do when we're confronted with a complex challenge is we engage in this activity called strategic planning. So if you walk into your office on a Monday morning and someone says, you know, we have this healthcare challenge, or we have this challenge with youth employment, or whatever it is, and you say, I think we should come up with a strategic plan, no one is going to look at you like you have two heads, right? No one's going to say, why would we want to do that? Everyone's going to say, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, strategic plan. So we're going to come up with a 5-year plan, we're going to implement the plan, and it's going to solve the problem. So that's what we do. That's what we're trained to do. And strategic plans have a particular quality and characteristic. They're very rational. They're very predictable. You write down what you're going to do over time, inputs and outputs every quarter, so on and so forth. It all looks good. And the problem with strategic plans is that they don't work. That's the problem. And so I make the case in my book and in other places that strategic plans have a failure rate of 90% plus, which means if you think about 9 out of 10 things you do in a strategic planning mode will fail, basically. Yeah? And when you're dealing with situations where you have these two curves, right, these supply and demand curves diverging, I would argue that strategic planning probably has a 100% failure rate. So you can look at situations, right, where you can water or healthcare, and you can look at these two curves, and you can basically put down a strategic plan, and the strategic plan doesn't even work on paper. So the numbers don't even add up on paper. So you look at the numbers on paper and you say, what are we going to do? How much are we going to spend? How are we going to deal with this issue? And it doesn't even add up on paper, let alone when we try and implement the plan, right? So the numbers don't add up. And that's obviously not, that's not something we necessarily talk about. But, you know, I had a conversation, I've had this conversation sort of many places where I say to people, okay, what is the failure rate in your organization, right? It doesn't matter whether you're in the public sector or the private sector. It's like, what's the failure rate of what you do? So out of 10 things that you try in your organization, how many of them succeed or fail? Can we get any answers from the audience? What would you say? Anyone? Shout out some numbers. So out of 10 things that you try, how many of those fail by any measure? Anyone? Number? How much? More than half, okay. What else? 7? No idea, okay, yeah. What else? So I was with an organization, it was one of these large global NGOs, and I asked this question, so everyone worked for the same organization. So from this corner of the room, someone said 2 out of 10. So, you know, 80% success. And then from this corner of the room, someone said 9 out of 10. And it was like, so you're saying 9 out of 10 things that you do fail, and you're saying 2 out of 10 things you do fail. And then they had this massive argument. And they said, all these people, about 40 people, had this massive argument. And then they said, well, actually, we were telling you about the acceptable failure rate, not the actual failure rate. The actual failure rate is probably 90%. But the acceptable failure rate is either 0 or 2, basically, right? So the challenge of business as usual is that if we're dealing in particular with these supply and demand curves, then those responses are going to fail. And I'll tell you why they're going to fail. Because as a strategy, if you think about meeting demand, right? So you think about supply of hospital beds, let's say, and that is declining and demand is going up. Your strategy has to actually not just flatten that curve a little bit, it's got to flip the curve. You've actually got to go from decline to actually meeting demand that is exponential to a certain extent. So it's not like a 20% increase is going to do any good. Does that make sense? So the numbers Unless you can flip that curve completely, what you're doing is you're just flattening the curve where you're actually going to hit the bottom of the curve a couple of years later. And that's mostly what we're seeing in terms of responses to complex challenges. That what we're doing is we're sort of flattening the curve so that, you know, it's not going to happen in 5 years, it might happen in 8 or 10 years, right? And the curve is just getting flatter. And what we're doing is we're basically passing the problem down to another generation, or even just to ourselves a couple of years down the line, 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line. So we're just passing it on a little bit. And I think that's the challenge that we need to confront when we're dealing with complexity. We have to basically figure out strategies that have a hope in hell of actually flipping those numbers and actually not just flattening the curve and sort of, you know, passing the buck down. And one of the things is that we're huge fans of technology solutions to challenges. So when confronted with complex challenges, we often seek out and search for technological solutions. So I'll give you an example. So if you think about the water crisis and you think about declining freshwater and demand for water going through the roof, so one of the favorite solutions to that is obviously desalination. So you build a desalination plant on an ocean and you basically turn salt water into fresh water. And obviously this takes a huge amount of energy, but you know, if you have a lot of energy, like Canada does, for example, you also have a lot of fresh water. But the Gulf states in the Middle East, for example, desalination is a favorite strategy for dealing with their water crisis. And you know, I hadn't really thought about this. I met a biologist a couple of months ago in Mexico, and she works in the Gulf, and she said to me, well, what do you think they do with the brine that's generated as a result of desalination? And I said, oh, that's interesting. She said, so what we're producing when we desalinate is concentrated salt water, basically, super concentrated salt water. And so what do you think we do with it? So I don't know, what do you do with it? She said, well, there's two options. One, you pump it back into the ocean, or you pump it underground. It's very expensive to pump it underground, so into the rocks. Now, what they're doing is, most often what you do is you pump it into the sea. And so she said to me, well, what we're discovering is the salinity of the Persian Gulf has actually changed. And actually what we're doing is the oceans are getting saltier in the Persian Gulf just as a result of desalination. And that's having massive impact on, obviously, these marine ecosystems. And that kind of blew my mind. It was like, wow, that is amazing that we're not thinking about this. And he said, yeah, the people just building these things and just pumping super concentrated brine into the oceans as if it has no impact. So that would be an example of a tech solution. And typically with tech solutions, you have lots of unintended consequences that you don't really think about necessarily up front. So, and also what tech solutions tend to do is they tend to sort of flatten that curve, if you like, rather than flip the curve. There are instances where you could flip the curve, but one of my colleagues calls technology as the great wager. And there's this story of Jared Diamond, who's this anthropologist, teaching his students about Easter Island. Does everyone know about Easter Island? The island that basically in the Pacific that was essentially depopulated, and they cut down the last tree. So the question he asks his students is, what were they thinking when they cut down the last tree on the island, right? So there's nothing on the island. They're reliant on trees and, you know, this ecosystem. So what were they thinking when they cut down the last tree? And one of his students said they were thinking technology will save us, right? Or God will save us. And that, to some extent, is to be very critical, you know, the sum of our strategies today in response to these challenges, that we basically think that something is going to happen that will change those curves. And nothing is going to happen. They're basically there, and we've got to deal with them. And as I said at the beginning of this talk, the playing field is pretty level, so it's not as if, you know, you all can go somewhere else and someone solve this problem and you can learn from them and you can come back and say, okay, we now know how to do it. The solutions to the challenges are basically in this room. So that's the bad news. The good news in a sense is that we know how to solve these challenges. We actually have in our histories and our legacies examples where we have tackled challenges that are complex in nature, and we just need to do a little bit more of that. So the analogy I use to describe what it means to address complex challenges. So what's the practice, if you like, of addressing complex challenges is, the analogy I use is cooking. So you think about cooking, right, as a practice. So when you cook, you need ingredients, you need a bunch of tools, you need to learn some processes, and you put all of those things together. You typically do it in a kitchen, and you cook something, right? And the only way of learning how to cook something is by cooking something. So there's no way you can study a book for 2 years and then basically go, okay, I've studied this cookbook for 2 years. I'm going to cook you the best meal you've ever tasted, right? It's not going to happen. And what happens when we learn how to cook is that we typically cook things that don't taste very good initially because we're learning how to do it. And we need guidance when we learn how to cook, whether that's in the form of a TV show or a cookbook or whatever it is. But we need some guidance. And the only way of getting good at cooking is to practice. There's no shortcut, right? And what I find when dealing with particularly questions around, how do I learn how to do this stuff, or how do we learn how to address complex challenges, the focus is often on tools and processes. So people say, I need a tool to help me do this. And that's a little bit like saying, I want to learn how to cook, but all I want to talk about is frying pans and knives, right? Obviously, you need frying pans and knives, but your tools are just one component of your overall practice. So if you think about what the practice is for addressing complex challenges, and we think about the sciences, and we think about, okay, what do we do with a medical problem like AIDS or cancer, we kind of understand what the practice is in those spaces. So no one goes to a cancer researcher and says, I'd like you to come up with a 5-year plan, and I want you to define your inputs and your outputs every quarter. And by the way, if you can't tell me how many people you've cured of cancer in 5 years, I'm going to fire you. Right? Just doesn't happen, right? We know that that's not how it works. Or if you think about, trying to come up with an AIDS vaccine, that's not how it works. We know that you can't define the inputs and outputs every quarter, and you can't predict when you're going to cure AIDS. We know that, right? And we fund researchers to do that work for us. And what we're funding in that case is not a plan, right? So we don't say to the researchers, come up with a strategic plan for curing cancer or AIDS, and then implement the plan, and then the problem will have been solved. We don't do that, right? We know that that doesn't work. We know it's kind of a nonsensical request to make. And what we do instead, if you think about those domains, is we fund talent. We basically say, okay, so you want to set up a cancer research institute, you want to solve this problem. Who have you got? Who are you bringing to the table? Who's going to be doing the work, right? And what we do is we fund the talent to focus on coming up with responses and solutions to the challenge. That is the way of dealing with these open-ended challenges, right? And we need to do the same thing in this space. So if you think about the challenge of unemployment or climate or public health care, any of these challenges, the basic response that we need is we need to bring teams of people together. We need groups of people that can focus on the challenge, that have the time and the space to essentially do the work. And that, in some ways, getting to that point is actually the difficult part. So the issue with business as usual responses is that we have no space. There's no time to do anything other than what you normally do. So you get up in the morning, your day is full, you come back, you don't have resources, things are getting worse, you're spending a lot of money, but you don't have the space to actually come up with a response. It just doesn't exist. So the primary challenge in addressing complex challenges is, where is the space to do the work? Where in your institution, organization, in your society, in the province is the space to actually focus time and energy and talent on the challenge that you want to address? And how do we create that space? So the title of my book is The Social Labs Revolution, and a lot of people say, well, what is a social lab? And the most common assumption is that it's a process, right? And so it's technically not a process. A lab technically is just a space. So if you think about a chemistry lab or a physics lab or a biology lab, those are spaces where you have a set of tools and a set of resources that allow you to do a certain type of work. And a social lab is the same thing. It's a space that allows you to do a certain type of work. And the challenge is, how do we create that space to allow certain types of teams to come together and do the work? Now, what kind of teams do we need to do this work? So when you're dealing with a scientific problem, you need a bunch of experts. So you need people who have particular scientific expertise to do the work, right? Scientists. With social challenges, that won't work. So what we can't do is bring together a homogeneous group of people who think the same, planners, and say to them, come up with a solution to these problems, and then we're going to push these solutions down on society, and then we're going to have a solution. What we need instead are teams that are characterized by diversity. So we need teams that are characterized not just by professional diversity, so it's not just economists working with anthropologists, but actually we need what I would call vertical diversity. So white-collar diversity is essentially people who all know how to use Post-it notes, right? And people who basically know how to use a flip chart and come to a conference and sit at a table, right? So that's a certain type of diversity, what I would call horizontal diversity. So the teams that we need are constituted of vertical diversity, so people at the front lines, people at different levels of a system, and we need to bring these people together and resource them to address the challenges that we think are most important to address. And then the final thing is, what's the process that they go through? So the process they go through isn't coming up with a 5-year plan, but it's actually coming up with a portfolio of interventions and trying those things out. So it's like, come up with 5 or 6, 7 or 8 different things to do, try those out, and try those out early and see which ones are going to work and which ones are going to fail. So your failures essentially are things that no one is really going to care about in 2 months. No one's going to remember it. Whereas in a planning-based system, failures are things that live on for years. It's like we spent, I'm reading this book called The Prize, and it's basically about Newark School District in New Jersey, and Mark Zuckerberg gave a gift of $100 million to Newark School District. It's one of the worst performing school districts in the US, to actually improve the school district. And they basically blew the money. So nothing happened, right? And nothing changed, really. Now, that is not the kind of failure that I'm talking about, right? So don't blow $100 million and basically say, oops, we tried, it didn't work, right? And we need to fail and learn from our failures. That's the wrong kind of failure. So what we need to do is we need to fail at a level that is small enough and low risk enough that it doesn't really matter. So basic response, if you like, to a complex challenge is that you need a space to work in. You need enough degrees of freedom to try things out, and that means freedom from procurement rules and all sorts of other institutional, cultural barriers that stop us from trying things out. You need a team that is diverse and actually represents, if you like, a broad group of actors that have an interest in the space, in the issue that you're dealing with, and you need a process that is essentially trial and error, that's iterative. And those 3 things, if you like, constitute a much better strategy than strategic planning for addressing complex challenges. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and what I'd like to do is let's talk about this a little bit. So we've got plenty of time. We've got half an hour. Yeah, what questions are coming up? What thoughts are coming up? Does this make any sense at all? Does it make no sense? So if we can pass a couple of mics around and just hear from people, that would be good. Questions? What's coming up? Do you buy any of this? Does anyone want a mic? I'm basically just going to wait here until someone asks a question, so don't mind me. Dana? Oh, go for it.
I think this will work. Is it on? Yes. Yeah. So I'm curious what happens on the experimenting and the iterating in the lab when you have these people together kind of out of context with whatever the complex challenge is. Yeah. How does that work? What does that look like?
Okay. So 2 things. One is context is everything, right? So you can't come up with solutions out of context. It doesn't make any sense. And you can't come up with a strategy that is decontextualized. It doesn't make any sense. So the first thing is that the team that you constitute has to reflect the context that you're working in. So they have to reflect the key actors, the key stakeholders that you're addressing. The other thing I would say is that there's this perception, if you like, that we're going to run a bunch of pilots and then we're going to test these pilots and then we're going to scale these pilots, right? That's kind of how we think about these things, that, let's test a little bunch of small things, prototypes that won't fail, and then, let's scale those up and da-da-da. So scaling strategies basically don't work. They're a waste of time. You never manage to scale, right? It just doesn't happen. So forget about scaling up. Now, what do you do if you don't scale up? So one of the other problems I find with this sort of work is that it's what I call the World Cup problem in my book. So people call me up and they say, hey, we need some help with something. I say, well, what do you need help with? Well, we want to eliminate global poverty. We're like, oh, that's really good. What kind of resources do you have to do that? Well, we want to run a workshop. And you're like, well, that's not going to do it. You can't run a workshop that's going to solve global poverty. And they say, well, how much money do you have? And they say, well, we have like $100,000. So, well, that's not going to cut it either, right? And then you say, well, what kind of people do you have to do this work? And they say, well, we have one person working on it a day a week. It's like, that's not going to work, okay? And it's like, but why isn't it going to work? You guys are experts. You've been doing this. Help us figure this out. It's like, it's not going to work, right? You're not going to tackle global poverty. So in that situation, you have two options. One is you either change your goal, and you basically say, look, that goal is ridiculous. We don't have the resources to tackle it. Or you basically realize what the odds are in terms of what you're dealing with. And so this is where I think the context issue comes in, that you know, in the UK, we have something called the National Lottery, and it's basically 6 numbers to win the National Lottery. So the odds of winning the National Lottery are 14 million to 1. Those are the odds of winning the lottery. Now, a decontextualized approach would basically say, I'd like to hire you to help me win the lottery, but I don't like these odds, so I'd like the odds to be 50%, right? And you would look at me and kind of go, well, what are you talking about? The odds are 14 million to 1. I'm like, no, I don't like that. Those are unacceptable, politically unacceptable odds, right? So I want you to come up with a strategy that's going to help me win the lottery, but I want the odds to be at least, you know, let's say, you know, 2 out of 10 things that you do can fail, but 8 of them have to succeed. 8 attempts at winning the lottery have to succeed, right? So what's your response? What do you say to me? So you have there's 2 things you can say. One thing you say is, you're crazy and I'm not going to work for you, or you basically make it up, right? You game it. You basically say, we can come up with something, right? Right? And it's like, but it doesn't make any sense. And so context determines everything. And, you know, a decontextualized strategy, a lab, and this is why the participants or the people that constitute the lab have to reflect the diversity of the system you're in. You cannot have a group of planners or a group of experts coming up with solutions in a lab, right? Which is essentially cut off from society, and then you're going to come out with the solution and say, hey, we figured this out. Why don't you all do what we think you need to do? It just doesn't work that way. So the notion of a lab as a space, in some ways, a chemistry lab or a physics lab is a space that is decontextualized or out of context of society. The lab is actually in society. So when we run labs, for example, one of the things we do is we take people out into the community or into wherever they're working, and they have first-person experiences of what they're dealing with. So we ran a lab in India on child malnutrition, and we took everyone to live in communities where people were malnourished for a week. Now, when we proposed this, we had a bunch of people from government, and they said, that's ridiculous. I've been to thousands of villages. I'm not going to go live in a village for a week. Like, why do I need to go live in a village for a week? What am I going to learn? And they were pretty upset. And they were pretty upset because they had to eat what people in the village ate. They had to live there. They had to sleep there. And it was just like, can't we just stay in a hotel and drive in every day? You know, there's all these arguments about it. And we went and lived there. And they complained for about 24 hours. And then after 24 hours, they were like, oh, this is completely different from what I thought it would be. So on paper, all these villages have electricity, right? So in official government documents, they all have electricity. But what we've actually discovered is they only have electricity for 1 hour, and it's between 2 and 3 in the morning, right? So farmers are getting up at 2 and 3 in the morning to go and pump water because that's the only time they have electricity. We didn't know that. So our strategies have to incorporate these little, they have to incorporate reality, basically. You have to function in the real world. So I would say context is everything, and if you're decontextualized and forget about it. Is that a long-winded answer?
That makes me incredibly happy to hear you say all of those things. So I work for the U.S. Digital Service, and we go work on IT projects across government. One of the first things that we do is we go to the place where the systems are being built, and we just camp out there for 2 weeks. And we look in all the drawers, and we open all the closet doors, and we make people talk to us who don't want to talk to us. And at the end of those 2 weeks, we make some recommendations about what we think that they should do. But we couldn't possibly do that without being present all the time. Yeah.
So I've worked in Canada a lot, believe it or not, and the first time I worked in Canada was in 2004. And I was working on First Nations issues. In particular, we were working on teenage suicide and First Nations issues. And one of the first assignments I got was to organize a visit to a reserve outside Calgary. And I called them up and I basically spoke to, the band chief's secretary, and I said, hey, we want to bring a bunch of people down to visit you and to understand what's happening in your community. And they said, oh, that's great. Who's going to come? So I said, well, there's a bunch of deputy ministers and there's and they said, oh, well, we can't guarantee their safety. And I'm calling from London, by the way. And I was like, what do you mean? I said, we can't guarantee their safety. We can't guarantee that they're going to be able to leave if they come. I said, did you just say that you might kidnap them? And they said, well, we just can't guarantee their safety, so, And then I was just astonished. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And then the guy says, but we could for $50,000. I said, well, did you just say to me you can guarantee their safety for $50,000, but not otherwise? And he said, well, it's going to take a lot of our time and attention and energy, and for $50,000 we could guarantee their safety. I was thinking, I can't believe I'm here. This is Canada, right? We're talking about. Anyway, so what happened was that they had a rodeo going on in the community while we were there. So we just went to the rodeo. So we took all these deputies and a whole bunch of people to the rodeo, and we hung out in the community. And one of the people who was with us was an MP who's the head of the Parliamentary Affairs Committee on First Nations issues. And we couldn't get her out of the rodeo. So she spent about 5 hours in the rodeo talking to people, and we just couldn't. We had to drag her out. And when we got her out, we said, what's going on? Like, why were these conversations so interesting? And she said, look, I've been in this post for about 3 or 4 years, and I've never met someone from a First Nations community other than across a negotiating table. That's how I meet people. We sit down at a table, a bunch of issues, and we negotiate across the table, and that's my conversation. And I turn up here, people don't know who I am, they don't care who I am, I tell them who I am, and they don't care. And they say, oh, you want to understand what's going on in our community? We'll tell you what's going on in our community. And they dragged her around, and they basically showed her things and told her things that she'd never seen before. That's context, right? And basically that's part of the practice, if you like, of doing the work, which is it has to be contextualized. I can't, sitting in London, tell you what you need to do here. Other questions?
I'm curious about your New Jersey example. How did they blow the $100 million by contrast to what you're suggesting?
They hired lots of consultants, and they came up with lots of strategic plans, and yeah, they blew it. The book is definitely worth reading. But, let me just give you another example of how you blow that kind of money. So when I was working on this Yemen thing, I called one of the large consultancies, it's McKinsey actually, I'll tell you, because it's in a WikiLeaks cable. McKinsey was hired by the Yemeni government to come up with a rescue plan for Yemen. And there's a cable from the US Embassy in Sana'a to the State Department basically saying, look, there are no options on the table. This is the only option. We need to hire McKinsey to come up with a rescue plan for Yemen. And so the Yemenis can't afford it. They can put in $3 million, and we need to put in the rest of the money, which is $5 million, because there's no options on the table. Anyway, so they put in $8 million. They hired McKinsey, and McKinsey came up with a strategic plan to rescue Yemen. And the strategic plan was written probably in Dubai or Abu Dhabi by some analysts, and they submitted the plan to the Prime Minister's office, and 3 weeks later, the Arab Spring happened. And they took the plan and they threw it in the dustbin. That was the end of it. Nothing else happened. So that deck, if you like, right? This document was worth $8 million. That's what people paid for it. And that's how you spend $100 million, right? You just add a couple of those up and you get $100 million. And we all know what that looks like. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Morning, Zaid. So we're super excited about the idea of bringing to fruition social labs as a framework for New Brunswick. And we've started the journey, and we actually have 6 that have launched. But a couple of things maybe that I'm looking for from your advice perspective and your level of experience in working with labs. Number one, we noticed that the lab leadership teams that applied and were formed are 90% representing organizations from the plural sector. So we've got these incredibly passionate individuals who've been working on these complex social problems in a variety of different ways, and they're the ones who are coming to the table. But you talked about not having homogeneity in those teams, and what kind of strategies can we use to get more senior government officials and private sector involved in those leadership teams, so we have that very sort of holistic team. And the second one is attention span. Our attention spans are shrinking every day, and solving complex social problems is a multi-year endeavor. How do we keep labs really relevant in the citizens' minds and keep the energy up as we move forward, because a lot of these problems are going to take a certain amount of time to be able to come to fruition?
Right. So the question I'd ask is, what's everyone doing with the rest of their time? Good question. Right? So what they're doing with the rest of the time is what I would call business as usual. And then it's like, okay, we can take a couple of hours a week or a couple of hours a month to work on this kind of stuff, which isn't really going to work. So the question is, how do you get beyond that, right? So one of the biggest issues I see with this space and doing this kind of work is that what people often do is they try and sell a process. So they basically say, okay, we're going to run a process, and the process is going to address the challenge. How it's going to address it, we don't know. What are we going to get? We don't know. So I was telling a couple of people, I had this conversation with a deputy in Nova Scotia a couple of years ago, and he said, look, you're just getting a bunch of people in a room and they're going to sit around and talk, and I can't fund that. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He said, well, they can't tell me what they're going to do or what they're going to produce or what results they're going to generate. So I can't fund that. I can't fund a bunch of people sitting in a room talking. And that is the challenge, right? Which is, what are you actually going to generate? What are you going to produce? And the answer most often given to the question, well, what kind of results are we going to produce? Well, it's complex and it's emergent, so we don't really know. That is a huge challenge. You're not going to be able to attract resources, talent, time, energy, unless you can address the question of what are we actually going to get? If we invest time and energy in this, what is it? What results are we going to generate? So one of the kind of counterintuitive things I say to teams that I work with is that you need to basically be able to say what the quantifiable goal is and what the scale of the challenges that you think you're going to address in the time that you're going to address it. So you need to tell me, is it 100 people that you're going to impact, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 5 people? Like, how many is it, basically? And that's an aspiration. That's not like, that's contraction. Now we're contractually bound to addressing that. But it's like, our aspiration is we want to impact 5,000 people or 10,000 people or 50% of people or whatever it is, right? And you need to be able to say that in order to attract the time, energy, and the talent needed to do the work. And also from that scale of impact, knowing what that is, you also know what resources you need to genuinely address it. And most efforts in this space are so dramatically undercapitalized that they have no hope of changing anything. And usually what people are doing is they're saying, why don't we try this out? And if it demonstrates any success, then we'll scale it or we'll put more resources in it. And because they're so undercapitalized, the likelihood of them succeeding is pretty low, basically. So I would say you've got to quantify it, you've got to say what the scale of the challenge is. And going back to the scaling point that I made is that forget about scaling, operate at scale, right? So operate at this level of the challenge that you want to address and figure out what resources you need. But you need to be able to say to people, look, we're trying to impact, the bottom 10% of the population that requires, support for social housing, and that means 5,000 people in this area. That's what we want to try and impact. And I need resources that are equivalent to that, that are a function of that challenge in order to do that. And if you say to me, well, you can have $20,000 and, one person working on it 2 hours a week, not going to happen, right? Is that? Yep. And the general response I would say is, you need to look at the preconditions. So what are the preconditions you need in order to do something, and get the preconditions in place. And if you don't get the preconditions in place, then it's unlikely that you're going to produce a result. And then people say, hey, we tried that thing, it didn't really work. Yeah? Other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
How can we break from business as usual? How can we change our government to break from business as usual in a way that scientists agree with, let's say, and not industry maybe, or individuals?
So just say a little bit more. When you say scientists agree with, is there a specific case or an instance that you can think of?
Maybe climate scientists.
Right. Well, you've had a slight change of government that should help. So I think the climate science thing is kind of an interesting one. So I've done a lot of work in the climate space over the last 10 years, and one of the things I found is that there's a lot of tactical presentation of the numbers and the figures, right? So I'll give you an example, right? So I was talking to this guy from Greenpeace in Germany, and he gave this speech on climate change, and he basically said, Germany needs to reduce its emissions by 60% in order to reduce dangerous climate change. And I went up to him afterwards, I said, you know that's not true, right? It's 90%. And he goes, yeah, I know it's 90%, but I can't say that. I was like, why can't you say that? He said, well, everyone will laugh at me if I say that. You know, I can't stand up on stage and say Germany needs to cut its emissions by 90%, otherwise there's going to be dangerous climate change. So I'm saying it's 60%. And it's like, yeah, but you're probably going to fail to reach the 60%, and then it's going to be really bad because, you know, it should be 90%. And he said, well, what am I supposed to do? I can't say what it is. And I would say that, you know, you can probably divide scientists into two classes. The class of scientists that will just tell you it's 90%. That's the deal. And it's, you know, you got to figure out a strategy. And the scientists who basically will say to you, well, I'll fudge the figures because it's politically unacceptable to say it's 90%. And, you know, there are a couple of scientists in the climate space that will just tell you straight up what it is. And most of them, I would think, do. And I think the challenge is, if you can't come up with a political response that is commensurate with the science, then it's a bit like, well, it's hopeless. What's the point of trying anyway? But it goes back to the comment I made around the odds of winning the lottery, right? You need to know what the odds are before you devise a strategy. And I think that it's entirely feasible to devise strategies that don't require us to, you know, drop our GDP by 30 or 40% and live, you know, like, do you know what I mean? Like, we're not going to sacrifice quality of life and standards of living. So I think it's possible to devise a strategy if you genuinely look at the odds. And you genuinely say, what is it that we need to do? What are the resources we need? Let's go find them. Let's figure it out. So I think realistic strategies are entirely feasible and possible. And the challenge is looking at the real numbers, right? Looking at the real odds. And I think there's a huge appetite for it globally to do that. So does that help? Kind of. Good.
I guess, would you think breaking the party system up or taking money out of politics would help more because it's harder for many people, like one person, to get really rich off a solution that works for everybody?
Well, so I would say you've got to start with current reality, right? So start with where we are right now rather than where you think we need to be. Current reality is we're not going to break up the party system. That's not going to happen. So what is a strategy that you can start on now that actually gets you some way towards the goal? So, you know, for example, you could say, we want to reduce emissions here by 80%, right? That's a goal. What do we need in order to do that? Well, you need a lot of capital to do that. Go find the capital to do that. How would you find the capital to do that? Well, you need a strategy to do that. But you can set these goals and targets as aspirations and then figure out a strategy that is grounded in today's reality to figure out how to do that. And I think it's feasible to do that, even though it's hard. Other questions? Yeah.
What would be your advice about the strategy on education from the very early childhood up to the adult?
Right, good question. So I was in British Columbia a couple of years ago, and there was a guy from the Ministry of Education there. And, you know, he was being really critical about the education system. I was thinking, wow, that's interesting. He works for BC government. So I said to him, you know, what do people inside your ministry think about the current education system? And he goes, well, 50% of them think it's not fit for purpose and should be torn down and we should just start again. It's like, wow, 50% of you think that it's just completely useless. He said, yeah, 50% of them think it's total waste of time. So what about the other 50%? So no, they think nothing can be done about it. It just can't be done. I thought, what? So 100% of you think that the education system is a waste of time? And he said, yeah, 100% of us. And this is in the Ministry of Education, right? So I actually think education is one of the complex challenges that is most complex. It's almost like it's the PhD of complex challenges. And one of the reasons for that is that no one can even agree what the challenge is. So if you said to people, you know, I mean, we can do this now, right? How many of you think that our education system, there's a problem with the education system? So pick up your cards and vote, right? So green means no, yellow means maybe, red means you think there's a challenge with the education system. Okay, just have a look around the room. Okay, so are there any green cards? One? Do I see one? Anyway, so everyone thinks there's a problem with education. Now, if you ask people what the problem is with education, you're going to get 50 different answers, basically, or 150 different answers. So I would say that education is a really tough one, and I think that tackling it wholesale is very difficult. You know, and I haven't really seen any serious, what I would call kind of good strategies dealing with the education system. which goes back to my point that it's a very level playing field. Some people, everyone thinks the Scandinavian model is great, and the Finns and the Swedes have cracked education and so on. And I always point to sort of teenage suicide rates in Finland are the highest in the world, right? The highest suicide rates in the world, and it's like, well, maybe they haven't cracked it. So I would say I don't know, and it's wide open for people to tackle. I would say that it's ripe for someone trying to come up with a realistic strategy for how to do it. And the book I mentioned, The Prize, is really worth reading because it's sort of like, the old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I mean, that book is sort of the classic, let's fix the education system, and it doesn't happen. So it's wide open. One other thing I would just add is, when we think about complex challenges and the practice of addressing complex challenges, there are a huge number of questions that people don't really know the answer to, right? So you've raised one of them, like what's a good strategy for education? I don't know. Does anyone know? Probably not. Another question is, if you wanted to constitute a team and you could get anyone on the team, right? So going back to the question about, how do we get talent? So suppose you can have anyone, right? And you wanted to address the issue of education here. You can get anyone you want on the planet. Who do you actually want? What does a team that is good at dealing with complexity actually look like? What kind of skills do you have? What kind of capacities do you have in that? Does anyone have the answer to that question? No, nobody really knows. So there are a lot of questions in terms of how we deal with complexity that are really kind of on the edge, if you like, right, where we don't really have an answer. And the only way of figuring out the answer is to try something, trial and error, test it out, see if it works, and share what it is you're learning, basically. So, sorry.
Thanks. So we have some work to do.
Yeah, I think all of us do. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. So one of my questions is, I guess last year I got a chance to do the Grad SI course with like Francis Wesley and Bebs Zimmerman and whatnot. One of the things that we started doing a ton of time in was actually mapping out systems. And you look at the structures, the variables, all of that. But then one specific thing was looking at the minimum specifications within a complex system, so the basic ground rules. Do you think it's necessary for when someone's trying to make a solution within a complex system to I guess, have those minimum specifications or those rules? Because I feel like from a New Brunswick standpoint, I always make the comparison, let's say, from Ontario to New Brunswick. Ontario has Mars, has Communitech, has large infrastructure with at least 80 to 100 staff. In New Brunswick, you have 15, 20 organizations that are on average 3 to 4 people that all want to see New Brunswick being a better place but have competing interests. And so my mindset is that because of how the organizations exist, you end up having competing interests and the organizations have limited capacity in terms of delivering on what the community actually needs. So would it be necessary for the organizations to set minimum specifications on, okay, if we want to see New Brunswick being a better place, what are the basic ground rules that us organizations need to follow or use as a guideline? And I'm wondering how you dealt with that in other ecosystems or other communities when you have multiple organizations, sometimes complementary, sometimes competing interests.
So I'm not 100% sure, what exactly you mean by minimum specifications. But if you basically said that, there are a set of rules you've got to follow if you're going to participate in something, most likely what will happen is you'll set the rules as an idealized set of rules, and then people say, well, I don't want to follow them, right? So if you want me involved, well, I'm not going to be involved under these conditions. So I think the challenge is, how do you start with current reality in terms of, the contextual situation you find yourselves in, right? The situation of organizations competing for resources is true anywhere, right? So it's not that you've got a special situation here. I would say that, why people collaborate to deal with complex challenges is one of two reasons. There's either a carrot or a stick, right? So either something's going to go terribly wrong, right? Like the graphs that I showed you, and people are going to go, well, we can't have that. We need to do something about it. Well, there's a carrot, which is that if we collaborate with each other, we can get something that we can't get on our own. So what's the carrot, basically, and what's the stick? And I would say the carrot in this instance, I would guess, without knowing the specifics, is that working together and collaborating, your 15 organizations, you can probably access orders of magnitude more resources than you can together than you can as an individual organization. So, if your budget is $1 million a year, if you think about a complex challenge and you think we want a serious effort to tackle, say, the education system or climate or whatever it is, you can probably raise many orders of magnitude of money by working together. So I would say there's a massive carrot to be had if people basically set their sights and say, well, I'm going to participate in this, but we need to actually raise, an amount of money that is commensurate with the challenge we're solving, which my organization on its own can't do. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, thanks.
Last question? Yeah.
So just following on what you were just saying, I'm wondering if you can give us both a carrot and a stick. So you sort of said at the beginning there are all these impending crises, but then in history we've also heard a lot of these things that haven't necessarily come true. So I'm not saying it's not true, but I'm wondering if you can point to some specific examples where it has happened to maybe help us feel the urgency of it. And the second one is, can you talk about some specific outcomes that you have seen from labs that have worked? Like maybe you can't say they completely succeeded, but to show us that this actually has yielded positive results.
Yeah, sure. So the thing about the trends that I showed you is that they're trends, right? They're not predictions. Like, they don't have to happen. And one way of thinking about them is that there's sort of an engine that's driving each one of those trends. And if we can tackle the engine, if you like, the causal determinants, then there's a chance that we can impact them. So I'm not saying they're going to happen either. I'm saying that we actually have an option as to whether they're going to happen. We have a choice in whether they're going to happen or not. And for me, that's the big stick, that if we do business as usual, they're going to happen, right? And if we don't, and we do something differently, then there's a chance that they don't happen. So that's the big stick, if you like, from my point of view. In terms of just results and situations where we have seen changes. So we the work we did in India on child malnutrition had a really interesting impact, in the sense that child malnutrition in India is a huge issue. 200 million children. We were working in one state in India which had a population of 80 million, right? So this is just one state. And we were looking at extreme malnutrition in that state. And we did about 6 years of work there. And, we probably spent a couple of $1 million doing that work. And what we found after 6 years was UNICEF did a survey looking at extreme malnutrition in the districts across the state. And they basically found that malnutrition had dropped dramatically in the districts that we had been working in, right? And so obviously we can't claim full credit for that. We can't say, but there was a very strong correlation between where we were working and exactly the places where malnutrition had dropped. And the interesting thing about that is not that it dropped. The interesting thing is how much it cost, which was nothing. It was like a rounding error in the budget of the state budget, basically, which spends billions and billions of dollars on this issue. And we were brought in because it was having no impact, because actually the trends were going the wrong way. So I would say that's an example of a success. The other thing I would say is that most of the challenges that we're seeing are really unprecedented. There is no precedent for the scale of the challenges that we're seeing. And so there's no precedent for the solutions either, right? So if you can show me a similar challenge somewhere else historically, then you can come up with a response and say, well, historically, this is what's worked. But many of the challenges are completely unprecedented in scale, scope, size, speed, ferocity. So I would say that there are very few precedents that we can look to and take comfort from, so to speak. So in some ways, we've got to figure it out here and now. And I think we can. I think we have the resources to do that. Thank you. Thank you. It's very kind of you. And I'm here all of today, so if anyone wants to grab me.
That's great, Zaid. I remind you that Zaid is here all day today. This is interesting. Very different approach in presenting a topic. One that caused me to reflect. I think caused all of us to reflect. Zaid has reminded us that you have to go live the problem. You have to understand the context. You have to get out of the office, I guess. We have to go out on a limb because that's where the fruit is. And so if you're always going to be doing this based on the business case, you might be working on the lowest common denominator, only tackling the problems as people around you have come up to that level of understanding of that problem, whereas you need to go ahead of the problem. So maybe our institutions aren't the right ones to go ahead of the problem because they represent only what people can come up to collectively at that point in time. Not his words, my understanding from the reflection. Get vertical. Is that his word? Get that in place. Get the team in place. Collaborate. All things we know may be mixed together in a different recipe, making some really good stuff. In the meantime, we've got great coffee for you, and you've got 30 minutes, and then we're back. Thank you.